we can have both. We can have a healthy ocean and we can still, fly airplanes around the world. Because to be honest, like, yes, the idea of, let's reduce everything. Let's not fly. Let's not do this. That's not going to work. Even all the, the COP people and the UN people, they're all flying around the world all the time.
Hello everyone, welcome to Signal, where we spotlight innovative founders tackling climate tech's biggest challenges in transportation and aviation. My name is Dirk Singer. I'm the co-author of the Sustainability in the Air book series, along with Shashank Nigam, who is the founder of Simplifying and who many of you will know as the host of the main Sustainability in the Air podcast. So I came across today's guest after reading an article by the climate writer Kiko Toro, who predicted that she could become the world's first what he called Sargassum billionaire. Sargassum being an invasive brown seaweed, and that of course caught my eye, and I had to know more. That guest is Dr. Mar Fernández. She's a marine scientist who went from studying melting Arctic ice to building a company transforming Caribbean beaches. Now, here's the problem. Since 2011, massive Sargassum seaweed blooms have invaded Caribbean shores. We're talking millions of tons annually, forming the Great Sargassum Belt stretching all the way from West Africa. When it decomposes, it releases methane, it smothers coral reefs, and it costs tourism economies millions in cleanup. The current solution is just basically tractors hauling rotting seaweed to landfills. But Mar saw something different, an abundant, fast-growing biomass that someone will pay you to remove. Her Canary Island startup, MacroCarbon, converts Sargassum into a variety of products, including sustainable aviation fuel, that generates hydrogen internally, solving one of SAF's biggest cost problems. Now, whether Mar becomes a billionaire or not, her approach represents what aviation needs: a cost-effective feedstock that doesn't compete with food or arable land, and one that actually solves multiple environmental problems. We've produced a detailed explainer report alongside this episode, breaking down the technology, the economics, and why this might work where dozens of algae to fuel ventures have previously failed. So without further ado, let's hear how a scientist who studied Arctic ice is now planning to power aircraft with seaweed that nobody wants. Well, I'm joined here today with Dr. Mar Fernández Mendez, the founder of MacroCarbon, who's going to talk to us all about Sargassum and why it's so crucial in sustainability terms. Let's kind of kick off with something that I saw recently. I follow the climate writer, Kiko Toro, who has quite a well-known climate blog. He called you a potential candidate to become the world's first Sargassum billionaire, which is quite a sort of startling statement. What's your reaction to that prediction?
Well, I mean, we all wish for that, right? But how the world works right now, I'm not sure if pushing sustainability and new sources of energy will become the next billionaire business. But, we're working in that direction. And if at all, I will definitely become one of the experts in Sargassum and how to cultivate it in the ocean. So at least I'll take that with me.
Okay. Well, obviously, Kiko must have thought that what you're doing is very revolutionary. There's a lot of potential in Sargassum. So before we get into the business side, for our audience who may not even know what it is, can you explain in plain English what it is and why it really matters in terms of what you're doing? Yeah.
So Sargassum is basically a type of algae, like plants on land, but they grow in the ocean. And what's special about the particular species of Sargassum that I'm looking at is that it grows its entire lifetime floating in the ocean. So it doesn't require a substrate like a stone or a rock to live on, but it basically thrives in the ocean just floating. And what is interesting about that is that it can then grow in areas where otherwise only the microscopic algae can grow. And so then the question of how scalable this is in terms of producing biomass, then suddenly Sargassum becomes very interesting because it can grow in many, many areas in the ocean. And as you know, our planet is 70% ocean.
Absolutely.
So suddenly the areas where it can grow become massive.
Okay, perfect. I've seen your LinkedIn profile and your CV, and I believe that you had a career earlier when you were studying Arctic ice. How did you get from that, from the Arctic to a totally different climate, where you are in subtropical, tropical climates looking at a sort of a strain of seaweed or of algae, so to speak? Talk us through that journey.
So the truth is that my interest was always to find ways to sequester CO2 in the ocean, even when this was not a mainstream topic, right? This is what brought me to studying marine microbiology, because I believe the tiny algae in the ocean can help us do that, as they've done in geological timescales. And that's why I studied marine microbiology and then went into carbon and nutrient cycling in the ocean. And luckily for me, when I was starting my PhD, there was an offer for a PhD in the Arctic Ocean. And I decided to take it. And I used the chance to learn all the methods that are out there to quantify carbon uptake and carbon sequestration. And I got to go to the Arctic Ocean, which is a luxury, I would say. And what that made to me is that I saw firsthand the impacts of climate change. I would go every year to the Arctic, and even from year to year, you could see how it was rapidly declining. And so that brought me to strengthen even more my goal, which was to find solutions, right? And then I realized, okay, the solutions are probably not in the Arctic Ocean, because the productivity, the amount of carbon that is sequestered there, is relatively small compared to other areas. But it allowed me to understand how it works and how it could work better somewhere else. And so that's when I started transitioning towards more subtropical areas. First, working on artificial upwelling as a mean to enhance productivity in the ocean for carbon sequestration, and then going from the tiny algae to the larger algae because they are more efficient. So that's how the journey started, going from observing the problems to trying to find solutions for those problems.
So, I mean, I've spoken to a number of people who are working on, different types of algae or different types of seaweed. I mean, it seems to be, quite a well advanced area. What makes the particular type that you're looking at, and I know you've already touched on it a little bit, so special and so potentially revolutionary?
So what's special about Sargassum, besides that it grows floating and it can grow in many areas, is that it's also very efficient at carbon sequestration, in terms of, with very little nutrients, it can sequester a lot of carbon. Because you always need to remember that when we talk about sequestering carbon, we also need nutrients to do that, right? And in some areas, there might not be enough nutrients to do so. So Sargassum can actually grow pretty fast. It can double its biomass in between 10, 20, 30 days, depending on the conditions. But that's pretty fast compared to other plants and algae. And so it can also do it with very little nutrients. So that's why it becomes very interesting, because it can grow in areas where others cannot grow. And therefore, its carbon to nutrient ratio in the biomass is also very high. So if you do something with it, the amount of carbon in it is actually very high.
Okay. Now, I was reading recently in The Guardian that in the Caribbean, a lot of Caribbean countries, there is a problem with the buildup of sargassum, which is affecting the tourism industry, beaches, and also local fishermen. It kind of make the connection, because I gather you're based in the Canary Islands. How is what you're doing may also be able to to solve some of these problems, and is also what you're doing a global solution, so to speak?
Yeah. So maybe a bit of background history on where Sargassum comes from. So
Right.
Sargassum originates from the Sargasso Sea. So Christopher Columbus already saw it many, many centuries ago. And what has happened is that due to climate change and due to a North Atlantic oscillation that was basically stronger than it used to be, it escaped the Sargasso Sea. And it reached actually the Canary Islands, and then it made it down to the area that we now called the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, which basically spans between West Africa at the height of Cape Verde all the way to the Caribbean. And because of the currents and because of that increase in biomass in those areas, it ends up on the beaches of the Caribbean, causing all the problems you just raised. So Sargassum is not really an invasive species per se. It's just that it behaves invasively when the currents push it to land on the beach. And so when I started working on Sargassum, it was, of course, in the Caribbean, because that's where it's a problem. That's where we're trying to find solutions, what to do with it. But then when I got the chance to create my own company, I decided to create it in the Canary Islands, because the Canary Islands belong to Spain, and therefore they belong to Europe.
Right.
And so it's a chance that we have to grow Sargassum in an area that belongs to the European Union. So you can completely shift the European seaweed industry, right? Because at the moment in Europe, we try to grow kelp, we try to grow some ulva, a few other species, but that's it, and it's still very limited. But by expanding that to the subtropical areas, then you can suddenly grow another type of seaweed that is, as we said, has a huge potential for substituting fossil fuels at large scale, which we will talk about later. And so another issue is the issue of cultivation, right? Why cultivate sargassum if there's so much already in the Caribbean? So first of all, that perception that we have that there is so much, yes, it's a lot, but it's actually not that much in terms of what we're actually going to need for substitution of fossil fuels. And also, harvesting sargassum in the wild, like in the middle of the ocean, in the Caribbean, or in the middle of the Atlantic, is not really economically viable. So yes, when it reaches the beach, you can harvest it and do things with it, but it's still very expensive. Like around just harvesting it from the beach can be around $400 of per dry ton. So that's pretty high, right?
Right.
And so what we're trying to do is, yes, we support companies doing work in the Caribbean, collecting sargassum and doing things with it, but they cannot reach scale if we don't have a way to cultivate this sargassum and keep it year-round alive. And that's where we come in, and that's where we thought, okay, let's take it to an area where it's not a problem. In the Canary Islands, sargassum is not a problem, and let's try to cultivate it in a controlled way and learn how we can cultivate these species. This is like the beginnings of agriculture, right? You first need to understand the species, domesticate it, and then you can have a stable supply of biomass that will also help all those companies in the Caribbean scale and make use of that biomass. Because of course, for bigger companies that want the products out of sargassum, they need to have a stability. They need to know how many tons of that product you're going to be able to produce year after year. And if you depend on a wild algae that sometimes arrives in, several thousand tons, but other years nothing arrives or very little, then you cannot depend on that variability.
Can I just ask a sort of a technical question? I mean, there have been a number of companies that have, so far with varying degrees of success, tried to turn algae into biofuels. One of the best known ones I know has been trying to develop a genetic strain for the course of a decade. Do you have that problem? I mean, do you have to, sort of grow this and then genetically modify it to be useful, or you just grow it and that's it?
Okay, so I think what you're talking about is microalgae.
Right.
And so there is a whole microalgae to biofuels pathway that basically focuses on microalgae that contain high amounts of lipids, and then you extract those lipids as oil to do biofuels, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
This has actually never worked because of several reasons. One of them is just that, extracting those algae from the liquid and then extracting the oils, etc. It's just very energy and price. It basically elevates the price too much. So, and also if you want to cultivate those microalgae, you have to do it on land in bioreactors. So you need huge areas, and it's often monoculture. So as soon as you have like a virus or something, it kills the whole thing. So there's been several issues on that front. We are completely different to that. So our approach for biofuel production goes through a thermal biorefinery. So what we do is we convert the biomass into gas, into synthetic gas, and that gas to liquid. So we don't care about the quality of the seaweed. So we could also take rotting seaweed from the beaches of the Caribbean, right? And we are also really species agnostic. Like it could be any species that grows well in a given location. So that's why our approach is also global, because we could use any type of seaweed depending on the location that you are. So for example, pelagic sargassum, I would only use it in those areas where it's native, right? I wouldn't bring pelagic sargassum to areas where it doesn't exist. But there are other species of sargassum that you could use to do this.
Right.
So that's the potential for scalability as well.
Okay, maybe we just sort of take a step backwards. So you have these sargassum farms in the Canary Islands. You're growing this feedstock. What happens after you've got it? I mean, what is produced, and what is the whole process? Maybe kind of unpack our listeners through that, and just talk through how you get from your sargassum
wet
farm
algae
to then to an actual product, be it biofuel or something else.
Okay, so what we do is we harvest the sargassum, And then we pass it through a screw press and a dryer. And in the step of the screw press, we extract most of the liquid. And that liquid gets stabilized and filtered, etc., to create a biostimulant. So that can be used for agricultural purposes to enhance crop yields. So that's already an existing market. We have good collaborators working and selling already in that market, and we basically license the technology from them to do that. So that's the first product that we get out of that's why I call it the biorefinery, because we get several products out of the same process. Then the biomass, we dry it. And then that dried biomass goes into the gasification via pyrolysis. So it's a pyrolysis unit, low vacuum, no oxygen. And that's where we transform that solid biomass into gas and solid. And so the solid rest is called biochar. And that sequesters carbon permanently. So a percentage of the carbon that the seaweed took up in the ocean while growing is then stored permanently in that biochar. That biochar can be used either for soil amendment, or it can simply be buried or mixed with concrete to do carbon negative materials for construction. So it has several applications. But the important part is it sequesters part of the carbon permanently. The gas then goes into a middle step that is called methane pyrolysis. That's an electric methane pyrolysis. And what we do there is we separate the carbon from the hydrogen in the methane. So in the gas mix, there is methane, and we separate the carbon from the hydrogen. And what happens with that step is that we get another very valuable product called carbon black.
Okay.
Carbon black can be used, so it's 99% carbon, so it also sequesters carbon permanently. And it can be used, for example, for car tires. It can be used for inks. It can be used for batteries. So this is a very valuable product for the industry, and it has already a pretty well-established market with very few sustainable alternatives. So this is usually made with fossil fuels,
right,
with a very dirty combustion. And so we produce this in a very sustainable way. So that's our third product. So we have biostimulant, biochar, carbon black. And then what this step also does, which is a key differentiator of our technology compared to others, is that we enhance the amount of hydrogen in our gas mixture.
Right.
Other processes to produce sustainable aviation fuel, for example, require an external source of, in the best case, green hydrogen to boost their percentage. We don't need that. We create our hydrogen ourselves, so to say. So then that mix of gas that is now enriched in hydrogen goes into the final step, which is the Fischer-Tropsch reactor, which transforms basically the gas into the liquid hydrocarbon. Now we can then shift the parameters of that reaction, and those parameters are part of our trade secret. And we can basically decide which end product do we want. Like, do we want sustainable aviation fuel? Do we want marine diesel for the ship industry, or do we want bio-naphtha for the chemical industry to do plastics, for example? So we can decide depending on the client which one we're doing. Right now, we're focusing on sustainable aviation fuel.
Okay. Obviously, the big question around sustainable aviation fuel is cost. The cost of the process and the cost of the feedstock.
Yep.
Do you have any, indication about how you compare to existing pathways? Obviously, HEFA is the most common one by far at the moment. And how you would compare, towards, compared to Jet A, so sort of standard fossil fuel-based aviation fuel.
Yeah. So basically, I will start from the feedstock point of view.
Okay.
So of course, recycled oil, SAF has the issue that the amount of recycled oil that is out there is limited.
Of course.
And also there's been already some fraud detected in the chain to provide recycled oil. And then so we don't compare ourselves to that pathway, kind of. We compare ourselves to other biomass driven pathways. And in that case, we see ourselves as we are bringing a third generation feedstock into the game. So most of the other SAF producers, they're using agricultural waste, forestry waste, etc.
Right.
And so what we have done is we've detected the feedstock gap, basically. So in the market right now, when you look at the amount of SAF that we're going to need to produce for the EU refuel mandate, etc., we're going to need 7 million tons of biomass extra on top of the agricultural waste that is already there, right? So that's where we come in. And in terms of the cost, which is what you had asked, so at the moment, SAF is around $2,500 per ton. And we can produce at scale for around 1,500. So we still have a good margin to sell our product at the same amount that is being sold right now and still make a huge win. When you compare it with jet fuel, right? So fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Right now it's around 700, I think it is $600, $700 a ton. So if you calculate that they will need to pay for their emissions, right? And that's another 700 that you have to put on top of that.
Yeah.
Then suddenly we're also competitive with fossil fuel. So if you take into account jet fuel plus the carbon credits they're going to have to pay for, we are competitive against that as well. Of course, at scale, right? This only works when we're talking at 6 square kilometer aqua farm, 6-lane plant, right? If you start producing at a very tiny scale, then this doesn't work. This only works when you're at a certain scale.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about scale, and what you need to do. So you're based in the Canary Islands, and you just talked about the large quantities of biomass that would be required. You've mentioned the fact that that yes, at the moment you're targeting sort of aviation and marine fuel, but you've also highlighted a number of other industries, a number of uses that you could serve. What kind of scale are we sort of looking at? How big do these farms need to be to get you to that Sargassum billionaire stage?
Yeah, well, that will come with scaling slowly.
Yep.
So what our commercial scale, right, the one that where the unit economics makes sense, is 6 square kilometers of aqua farms and one processing plant on land that is has 6 lanes of pyrolysis and 1 Fischer-Tropsch at the end, right? And so this scale is perfectly achievable in the Canary Islands. They have areas around the islands that are already selected for aquaculture. Mostly now they're being used by fish aquaculture, but they can also be used by seaweed aquaculture. And so it's no problem in terms of space, right? You have enough space around the Canary Islands to do even several of these units, right? So this would be, of course, not 6 square kilometers all at once, but distributed in individual
Sure.
aqua farms. And so when you reach that scale, you are producing 8,000 tons of SAF per year. And that's roughly enough if you mix it, of course. At the beginning, SAF will always be blended with jet fuel. That is roughly enough for 400 flights back and forth to the peninsula.
Right.
So, of course, it's still, you
Quite
start small, but you can continue increasing the size. And what is also very good about our technology is that it's flexible in terms of which feedstock it takes, right? So imagine you have your plant up and running, your seaweed aqua farms up and running, and then suddenly there's a year where your sargassum doesn't grow that well, or whatever it is. No problem, because you can also put other residues in there. So we're already talking at a local level in the Canary Islands with wastewater managers like sludge from the water depuration compounds. And then we're also looking at organic waste from both agriculture and hotels, which in the Canaries, of course, have a big standing. Yeah. And so all those residues, you can also put them into your plant and transform them into SAF. So you can do a mixed feedstock approach in case the algae don't perform as well as you expected or wanted.
Just a sort of very practical question. I mean, you're producing the feedstock. Do you also intend to produce the fuel, or are you looking for partners to do that? I.e., do you have an end-to-end solution, or you do step 1 and someone else does step 2?
No, we do end-to-end. We are a vertically integrated company. That is sometimes good and sometimes not so good to raise funding, because of course that means we're capex intensive, right? Like the plant costs 60 million, so of course you have to raise a lot of money. 80 million. You have to raise a lot of money to to get there. But it's also, we build the plant and then 4 years later we are already in the break even and we're already making more revenues than what it costed to build it, right? So I think it's a worthwhile investment. But of course, we're competing with a very subsidized industry, which is the fossil fuel industry. So it's tricky. But yeah, I mean, when you reach that level and you're producing, then you have no problem to maintain it.
Okay. And then on that, why don't you sort of just give us a picture of what your roadmap for the next few years looks like? I mean, you mentioned, raising 80 million, I guess, euros for a fuel plant. When do you expect that to happen? Where are you now? And what's your step-by-step progression as we look for the next 5-10 years?
Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we are in the research and development phase. So we've proven all these pieces of the puzzle that I've told you. We've proven them individually, right? So the aqua farming, we have a 2,000 square meter aqua farm in the Canaries. Now we have the permit to put the next one, which will be 40,000 square meters. Permitting is also a big issue, so it's good that we have the next permit.
Sure.
And then from the processing side, we've produced already the first liters of hydrocarbons. They've already been tested by certain customers. We're closing now proof of concept with Iberia, Repsol, and Airbus to produce the first liters of sustainable aviation fuel. So those are the first steps. We're now, of course, aggressively raising our seed round. So that's a small one. That's 2 million. And that's basically to deploy the next size aqua farm and to produce 100 liters of products to distribute to potential customers. And then the idea is on the back of the offtake agreements that we will sign with those test samples, we would then start raising the big money. And that we have done in several steps. So we have a pre-series A, a series A, and a series B, which hopefully, if everything goes well between 2026 and 2029, we would raise those 3 steps. So it's pretty steep, but I think if you have committed investors, it can go very rapidly. And we use a blended finance model. So we're looking at equity, so private investors, as well as loans from banks. So we're doing roughly half-half, like depending on each stage, it's roughly 50-50.
Okay. You mentioned, just to take a step backwards, you mentioned Iberia, Airbus, and Repsol. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing with them?
Yes, so a year ago, we won the All for Zero Challenge in Spain for SAF production. The SAF Challenge was that then. And we've been basically negotiating with them since then the terms of the contract to do a proof of concept, a paid proof of concept. And so the idea now, it will start probably next month, and we will produce 2-3 liters of SAF that we will then we will basically bring them through all the certification processes and testings, basically, for them to check all the boxes and see if this is the quality that they require, etc., etc. And then, of course, with the hope of signing offtake agreements on the back of that.
Okay. Let's talk about scale and geography. We talked about the fact that you're based in Canary Islands and wine. Obviously, it makes sense being part of the European Union with the mandates. In future, do you see yourself expanding to other areas of the world, as you grow? Where and what geographical regions, we've mentioned the Caribbean, obviously, have possibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So the aim in the Canaries is to have our first of a kind, right? To then say, okay, now you've seen that it works, all integrated, it's de-risked, and now we can redo this in different locations. And so we are starting looking at areas like Morocco.
Okay.
We are starting to look at other islands, other archipelagos like the Azores, like Cape Verde, etc., etc. The Caribbean, I think, is a slightly different issue, because there, I think you need to start with collecting what is already there, and then you can go into cultivation. So there we have our ideas, and we also have partners there to work on that. So that's, in that scenario, I think we would come in more as the processing partners, as the aqua farming partners, but that's yet to be seen. And then what we're looking at as well, that's part of our innovation that we're working on, is to grow other seaweeds in a floating manner. So to domesticate, if you want to call it that way, other species to also grow floating, to use our methods that are basically key part of our IP. because that's what brings the cost of the biomass down. So the reason why other macroalgae approaches haven't worked in terms of macroalgae to biofuel is because the cost of production of the biomass was too high. Because if you think of the way we cultivate seaweeds right now, it's all with lines and ropes and buoys, and that is very expensive when you bring it at scale. So our secret sauce to grow the seaweed in these floating pens is what makes it economically viable. So we're looking at how to cultivate other species in a floating manner so that we can expand, for example, to Southeast Asia or other locations. So yeah,
Amazing.
in terms of where we can do this, it's the entire planet. If you pick the right species and you know how to grow it in this low cost way, then you can always do biofuel from it.
And let's just say, hypothetically, that you were to raise all the money that you needed and more. What is the eventual potential scale that we're talking about that you can do?
I don't think there's a limit to that.
Okay.
I mean, the limit is the ocean, and the limit is, how much funding we can raise for this. But there is no limit. I mean, we can really produce a lot of biomass from seaweed in the ocean. And I mean, we see it right now in the natural environment, right? Like Sargassum escaped the Sargasso Sea, and now it's growing all over the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. And we see it in some areas in China, for example, where you have square kilometers and square kilometers of seaweed aqua farming. So the scale is really immense. Like you can get to gigaton scale in terms of CO2 if you want to in 10 years.
Amazing. Okay. So just sort of a question about, the journey that you've taken, going back to what you've done. So you've come from an academic background, you're now an entrepreneur, running a startup with a lot of potential that has a lot of high profile partners, and that has had some big claims made against it. What have been some of the biggest challenges and learnings that you've made on that journey, coming from academia to where you are now?
Yeah, so maybe first a clarification. I continue being in academia. So since June, I became a professor at the University of Bremen. So together with the Alfred Wegener Institute, I still have my research group with my PhD students, and I do some teaching, like 4 weeks per year. And the good thing of that is that all those basic research challenges that we still have at the industrial level, I can tackle them from the academic point of view, right? I can go back and say, okay, let's create a PhD position to solve that problem that still needs 3-4 years development before we can do the technology transfer step and bring it into industry. So that's played really well until now. Also, I still get to motivate students at the bachelor level every year, a couple of weeks, and get that. We need those people that in the end will do this job, right? Like, this is not going to be me alone. We need many MacroCarbons and many companies like this one to make this happen at scale. And so I'm happy also to have that aspect within my career. And then in terms of combining academia with entrepreneurship, I think for me, one of the greatest discoveries at the beginning was that many of the skills that I had as an academic scientist were exactly the ones I needed to become an entrepreneur. Like, of course, I needed to learn new things, like how to do a business plan, how to pitch for investors, things like that. Of course, there was a steep learning curve, but there were already a lot of things that I already had that I didn't know that were useful for the entrepreneurship. And also, what I've also discovered is that there are more parallels than we think between the academic world and the entrepreneurship world. Like, for example, we tend to think, or I used to think as a young scientist, that, if you have good data and, the numbers match and everything matches, then, they will fund your project or they will fund your startup, right? And then you realize, it's not only about that. Yes, your numbers need to make sense. Yes, you need to have a ground case that makes sense. But you also need to know how to sell the story, how to package it in an attractive way. And that is something that suddenly you realize, okay, this is in both worlds the same. It's not always the best projects that get funded, but the ones that were communicated in a better way. And 100%. It's the same with startups right now. And also it goes with hypes, right? Like now we're entering the hype of, or we're in the middle of the hype of artificial intelligence and dual use cases, right? And so suddenly you have to go and think, okay, how can I what parts of my business can I bring into that so that I have more chances to acquire funding? So, for example, we are developing AI models to monitor and predict the growth of our algae species, right?
Mm.
Or dual use in the sense of energy independence, right? If you are an island and you have your own production of biofuels, that might be beneficial for you to become independent in a potential war scenario. So, you have to think about everything and be flexible, which is also part of the journey. And I think for me, one of the most difficult things to go through is all the people that are always on the very, very cautious side of things, on the conservative side of things, and also on the thinking badly pathway, right? Where they're always like, oh, but there's a conflict of interest
Sure.
and you cannot do this because we've never done it like this before. And it's like, come on, let's break all those walls that we're building for ourselves. This can be done. It's done in other disciplines. Like, how many professors are there in the engineering space that also have a startup, or in the medical biotech space? And why not in the environmental space? So I think it's breaking those walls that's been tough, but I think slowly, one step at a time, and managing.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. I mean, one of the things that, that I've been particularly sort of tackling with is, as I speak to startups all the time. And, and there are so many great ideas out there. And as you say, sort of so many great data sets and so many things that make sense, but there's so few breakthroughs. And that's actually one of the things in our book, Sustainability in the Air, that myself and Shashank Nigam, the founder of Simplifying, co-wrote. That's what we deal with in our last chapter. The fact that, this is a very hard space to scale, in terms of deep tech, in terms of climate tech, and that there's not one valley of death, there's actually three when you go through every single stage, because this is, a long process. You have to raise money, you have to plan out. And as you say, things like the story that you tell, or the stories that you're able to construct, are very, very important. And, and these are sometimes factors that some, startup founders forget, that they think, as you say, that the data in itself will get you the funding, when sadly it isn't actually like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, look, final question. So we're sitting here in 2035, in 10 years' time. You've achieved everything that you've wanted to. Paint us a picture. What does the world look like if Sargassum really takes off? And what are we talking about in 10 years?
So we're talking about having already maybe 2 of these first of a kinds, or maybe 3, depending on, how much money goes into it, are up and running. Maybe 1 in the Canaries, 1 in Azores, 1 in Cape Verde. And then we are expanding to Asia, to the Caribbean, right? And then suddenly people have realized the value of seaweed as a 3rd-generation feedstock for biofuels. And we finally cracked it to show the world that it works, that you don't need fossil fuels anymore, that you can do this, and actually that you don't need to reinvent the whole system, that you can still have liquid fuels, but that they come from a sustainable source. And that in our case, for example, what I think is very powerful is that our sustainable biofuels are also carbon negative, and they enhance biodiversity. So they come with benefits, right? It's like, that's why we call it our Blue SAF Plus, because it's blue, it comes from the ocean. And the plus it's carbon negative if you calculate the amount of carbon that goes into the biochar and the carbon black. And it enhances marine biodiversity, because that's something I haven't talked about too much, but Sargassum is a great habitat for marine animals, fauna, and invertebrates, etc. And so it creates this habitat around it. And if you can grow it in a way where you only harvest a portion of it every week or every 2 weeks, you always have this floating ecosystem that is thriving there. And so I think that's also important, that we have a world in 10 years from now where it's not choosing between, this or that. Is we can have both. We can have a healthy ocean, and we can still, fly airplanes around the world. Because, to be honest, like, yes, the idea of, let's reduce everything, let's not fly, let's not do this, that's not going to work. No. It's not working right now. I mean, even all the, the COP people and the UN people, they're all flying around the world all the time. So we just need to find solutions that make it possible in a way that is beneficial for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. And I think that one of the issues that the environmental movement has had, there's a climate scientist who once said that it's actually Catherine Hayhoe. She made a quote that I've always internalized. And she said that a lot of the environmental movement comes from what she called an ethos of sacrifice, which is that you have to do without. And that might be appealing to a small subset of people, but to the massive consumers, it is not. It is natural to want a better life for yourself and for your children, and to be aspirational. So I'm 100% with you. We have to find, solutions, and, what you're doing is very exciting and, seems to have a lot of potential. And I certainly hope that, you get the funding that you need to open that first of a kind plant. And that in 10 years' time, we're going to have the conversation about, about the Azores and Cape Verde and Morocco and all these other places.
Perfect.
All right. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much. And we'll put, a link about where to find you in the show notes as well. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much for the time.
That was Dr. Mar Fernández from MacroCarbon showing us how to turn an environmental disaster into transportation fuel. So what makes this different from the graveyard of failed algae ventures? And Mar isn't trying to farm seaweed in controlled environments at massive cost. She's getting paid to remove a waste product that's already overwhelming beaches. That economic flip, where your feedstock has negative cost, could be the difference between another failed biofuel story and something that actually scales. Now, whether she becomes the world's first Sargassum billionaire or not, MacroCarbon represents exactly what Signal is about: founders who see solutions where everyone else sees problems. So if you're working on breakthrough climate tech or know someone who is, reach out. I'm always looking for the next signal in the noise. Until then, this is Dirk Singer. Thank you for listening and keep innovating.